Presentation is to introduce you to the next generation science standards for secondary science. The objectives of this training are: number one, to provide a historical context as to where the standards came from, to introduce you to the framework for K through 12 science education created by the National Research Council, NRC, and to introduce you to the structure and intent of the next generation science standards, sometimes known as the NGSS. Also, to introduce you to the California State Science Framework. So let's begin with creating science pathways, the pathway from framework to standards. In the early 1990s, and even before that in the 1980s, some science educators were aware of a problem that we had in K through 12 education in California and in many states across the country, and that was that there were no standardized expectations or standards for students in kindergarten through 12th grade. That, of course, led to the fact that there were radically different expectations and radically different sets of standards and curricula. For example, a second grade science class in one district might be radically different than second grade in another district, and a ninth grade biology class in one high school could be completely different than a ninth grade biology class in another high school. The research in the early 90s led science educators to decide that they needed to create a set of standards. And by 1998, the first California content standards for science were created. And believe it or not, up until 1998, there were no standardized expectations across the state and for many states across the country. Almost as soon as they were released, however, the framers realized that they had made some major mistakes in the way that testing was causing science to be implemented. Further research in the early 2000s led them to realize that they had to make a major revision. In 2011, nearly over a decade after the first implementation of content standards, a new K through 12 science framework was created. The framework came from the National Research Council, which is, in this particular case, the authors were 50 leading educators and practicing scientists and engineers from around the country who came together to answer one simple question: what is it that kindergarten through 12th grade science students should be able to learn and be able to do by the end of their 12th grade? Okay, so the framework was written in 2011. And by 2013, the NRC hired another company called Achieve Incorporated to write a set of standards. And the standards are based on the framework. And the reason the standards exist is because the framework is a 400-page document, which would be difficult for teachers to implement because the implementation and the ways in which they're expected to teach the standards were not obvious to many teachers, and the purpose of the standards is to make it more usable for teachers in the classroom. We're going to go over how this happens. Three main resources that we're going to use. One is the K through 12 framework, that's sometimes called the National Framework, written by the National Research Council. The next is the California NGSS standards, written by Achieve Incorporated, and they are based on the K through 12 framework, and they are approved by the framework writers. The California NGSS standards differ almost not at all from the national NGSS standards. The only difference is the California standards have added some clarifying statements, but have changed nothing as far as the content goes. The California Science Framework is a third resource. That is in its final review and is expected to be adopted this summer. NGSS standards were adopted in 2014 by California and now are the California Science Content Standards. Okay, so the K through 12 Science Framework. The vision that these educators and scientists had was that learning is a developmental progression, and what they mean by that is that developmentally appropriate learning has to occur from kindergarten through 12th grade, and each year builds on the previous year. A focus is on a very limited number of core ideas. Many complaints from teachers across the country and other educators led them to conclude that there were simply too many ideas trying to be taught in each grade level, so that it forced teachers to address science in a very limited and shallow way. Sometimes people would call that an inch deep and a mile wide. Instead of doing that, they wanted to focus on some very important core ideas, and you'll see more about that later. The framework emphasizes that learning about science and engineering involves integration of the knowledge of scientific explanations and the practices needed to engage in scientific inquiry and engineering design. In other words, science is no longer a noun, as in a list of ideas. Instead, now, science is seen as a verb. It is the things that you do in design. And that's important. It's an important shift in the epistemology of science. The K through 12 framework components include 3 dimensions. They are the scientific and engineering practices, which I will sometimes refer to as SEPs, the cross-cutting concepts, which I'll sometimes refer to as CCCs, and the disciplinary core ideas, which I'll also sometimes refer to as DCIs. The disciplinary core ideas are broken into 4 main domains: life science, physical science, earth and space science, engineering technology, and the applications. Okay, to show how condensed the ideas in NGSS are, within the framework there's this very valuable one-page synthesis of all of NGSS. And I think that it speaks volumes that a very brief summary can be, for all of K through 12 science education, can be placed on a single page. Now, obviously, this does not go into depth or detail, but you are able to summarize everything that is expected for students to learn and be able to do by the end of their 12th grade. Okay, the 3 dimensions in the framework are, as we've already discussed, the science and engineering practices, and there are 8 of those. Here they are. There are cross-cutting concepts. There are 7 of those, and there are disciplinary core ideas, and believe it or not, there are only 13 of those combined. And so it's important to note one major shift in these standards is that there are only these 8 practices, which are the same 8 practices taught kindergarten through 8th or 12th grade, and there are only 7 cross-cutting concepts, again, the same basic concepts taught kindergarten through 12th grade, and there are only 13 disciplinary core ideas, or what we would call the big ideas of science, taught kindergarten through 12th grade. This is a significant simplification and condensing of the curriculum. I'm going to go into more detail about the disciplinary core ideas later in this presentation. Separated out here, the practices for K through 12 science classrooms, and these are sometimes called the science and engineering practices, or just called the practices. There are 8 of them, and those 8 are the same 8 that are taught kindergarten through 12th grade. To be truthful though, the first 8, the 8 are not all introduced in kindergarten. There are only 3 introduced in kindergarten, 3 in 1st grade, and the final 2 in 2nd grade. So that by the time students have reached 2nd grade, they have been introduced to all 8 of these. And then in 3rd through 5th grade, they are reintroduced to them, and they are expected to go into further depth. And in the middle school years, 6th through 8th grade, they again go into further depth, and once again in 9th through 12th grade, they are reintroduced and go into even further depth. So what you really have here is the 8 practices being introduced over the first 3 years, then taken to another level of depth in the middle 3 years, and even deeper in middle and high school. Okay, so when we think about practices, you probably are quite aware of some of these. Planning and carrying out investigations. There's a structure, a procedure, and a philosophy of scientific experimentation. And it's not clear that all students know this, and so it's going to be a big focus for these practices, that students understand that one of the jobs of scientists is to do these, to plan and carry out investigations. Another example is that they need to support ideas with evidence and recognize the adversarial nature of science. I think this is commonly misunderstood. For example, in everyday media, you'll often hear, for example, in one year you might hear that eating too many fats is bad for you in your diet, and then the next year you might hear that all proteins or all meats are a good thing in your diet, and then the year after that you might hear that carbohydrates need to be cut out of the diet. If you're not fully aware of what's going on here, it sounds like to the average audience that science just can't seem to get their thoughts straight. And I think that's doing a disservice. What's actually happening is there's ongoing debates in science, and that's the very nature of science. All right. The structure of scientific inquiry can be simplified in this way. The first thing is that scientists tend to ask questions leading to systematic investigation of the universe. I don't think a lot of students are clear on this, and sometimes it's not very clear in secondary science classrooms that one of the main jobs of scientists is to ask questions. Many students believe, mistakenly, that the job of science is to provide answers. Of course, we are seeking answers, but before you can seek an answer, you have to have a question. Results from investigations then lead to the formation of explanations. Now, what I hadn't emphasized earlier was that once you ask a question, you have to design an experiment in an attempt to try to answer the question. Once you get results from this investigation, you gather some data and you build a theory that is supported by your data to explain the answer that you have created to the question that you have asked. And finally, other scientists critically analyze the models for accuracy and robustness. In other words, it's part of the scientific process for others to argue from evidence to critique different models and theories. Cross-cutting concepts are the second dimension in the next generation science standards. And cross-cutting concepts are difficult for people because they represent the big ideas or the broad ways that we look at the universe independent of systems. For example, we might look for patterns, both temporal and spatial patterns. And patterns can be broadly defined. For example, you can see patterns in the way the moon travels around the Earth. You can see the waning moon and the waxing moon. You can see patterns in the way the Earth or the sun appears to travel across the Earth's sky. You can see that the sun dips further to the south in the winter and travels further to the north in the summer. Of course, you can see that the sun travels in a path from east to west on a daily basis. But you can also see patterns, for example, in mountains. You can see striation of different archaeological levels in the mountains. You can see patterns in leaves. You can see patterns in the ways animal skeletons are designed, and you can also see patterns in many other things. So patterns are a cross-cutting concept because being able to recognize and characterize patterns can be used in many different systems. One important cross-cutting concept is cause and effect. If you change one variable, it can cause a change in another variable. We often call the first variable the independent variable and the second one the dependent variable. But it's important here to distinguish between cause and correlation. Just because two variables are changing at the same time doesn't mean necessarily that the first caused the second. These are very important concepts, and they're often misunderstood by people. Another example is this energy and matter flows of flows, cycles, and conservation. Okay, so let me give you an example of what this might be. For example, in a pond, you might have fish that are in the pond, and fish may excrete urea into the water through their gills, their respiration through their gills, and through their waste products. And if that ammonia builds up to too high of a concentration in the pond, it can be lethal to the fish. Fortunately, there are nitrifying bacteria that break down the urea and into nitrites. There are further other kinds of nitrifying bacteria that break down the nitrites into nitrates. And in the pond, there are plants, and plants take nitrates up through their root system as part of their nourishment. And so at all different points in this cycle, either in the ammonia through respiration of fish, or nitrites or nitrates, or even into the structure of the plant, nitrogen is in existence in this cycle. And so the matter flows from one form to another, but that is not obvious because that happens at the microscopic level. And so it's important to note that if you understand a nitrogen cycle, or understand that matter flows through cycles, then you can be better set up to understand, for example, the carbon cycle in Earth, the biosphere of Earth. These big ideas are things that can be applied. For example, an ecosystem in a pond is different than the biosphere of the Earth, and the nitrogen cycle is different than the carbon cycle in the Earth's biosphere. And despite the fact that they're different, you can still examine both of those with the understanding of matter flowing in cycles, and matter is conserved. Disciplinary core ideas are the third dimension of the next generation science standards, and they are broken into 4 groups. The first is the physical sciences, and those are what we would have called physics and chemistry in the past. And they represent interactions between objects and particles at the atomic, molecular, and even macroscopic levels. The next is the life sciences, which we would have called biology, ecosystems and organisms from the molecular level on up, molecular to organism level of study. The next is earth and space science. That's biology, chemistry, and physics as it is applied to Earth systems, the biosphere, and the interactions with humans. And finally, engineering, technology, and applications of science. That is the application of scientific knowledge and principles to the solution of human problems. It's also worth noting that these core ideas, and if you counted them up, there are 13 of them. Those are the only 13 core ideas that are taught in kindergarten through 12th grade. And although some people are concerned that it's such a small number, the important thing is that students are taught these in depth, and they are taught how to think with them so that they can apply them to other systems. Okay, let's take a look at life science in detail. Now, the life science, there are 4 core ideas here. And those 4 core ideas are listed here as core idea number 1, molecules or organisms, number 2, ecosystems interactions, and number 3, hereditary inheritance and variation of traits, number 4, biological evolution, unity and diversity. If you went to the previous slide, you would note that these are the same 4 that were listed on that page. Also, this is the core idea right here, LS1. But there is a component idea that is related to that core idea. So information processing is a component idea that supports the core idea of molecules to organisms, structures, and processes. What does this mean exactly? Well, a good example might be, for example, information processing in a human could involve receiving information in the form of sound that is processed through the ear, and then signals are sent to the brain, and the brain processes that and tries to make meaning out of it. So the information processing that goes on through hearing or sight or a variety of other ways that humans interact with the world and the universe is one facet of an organism's structure and processes. So these ideas, these component ideas, support the core ideas. And there are anywhere from 3 to 4 of those, 2 to 4 of those in each of the core ideas. And so when I earlier said that there were 13 core ideas, each of them being supported by 2 to 4 component ideas, you have roughly 50 component ideas. Here's an example. The core idea is energy, and the component idea that I've selected here is conservation of energy and energy transfer. And so we want students to be aware of the core idea, energy. It's a big way of looking at the universe. And one of the component ideas here is that energy is conserved and energy is transferred through work or heat. Okay. The next thing that I want to look at is Earth and space sciences. Again, core idea, Earth and human activity. We want students to know that the Earth and humans interact with each other, and global climate change is a component idea of that. We want students to understand that climate change does occur, and that there are components of natural Earth processes that contribute to this, and components of human activity. All right, finally we get to the engineering, technology, and applications of science. And here I would like students to understand that applying the principles and practices of science in the real world means using the engineering processes to develop solutions to human problems in the universe. It's very difficult sometimes for people to define what they mean by engineering, and I'll put it as simply as I can by saying that engineering means using scientific principles to solve human problems. Okay, now we get to the structure of the next generation science standards. There are three, the standards are set up so that there are three portions that you need to be aware of. I'll roughly call them the top part, the middle part, and the bottom part. But to give them a more concise name, the top part here is called the performance expectation, the middle part is the three dimensions, and the bottom part are the correlations.